Right. So here we are in chapter 2 of Monsters, third edition. And in chapter 2, we're asking the question, how do monsters reflect their times? In other words, monsters are not always the same. They're not always the same across time and culture, places, people. So real obvious examples, for instance, the dragon is a good starting point. Many people think of the dragon as a fearsome, maybe evil creature. This is certainly the dragon in the European tradition. But in China, the dragon has a very different connotation, a much more positive connotation. They're monsters that have disappeared from the roster, if you will, of monsters. Go back into ancient Greece and other cultures and long, long time ago, and you find different monsters that, we kind of forgot about. And today's monsters, why are they here? What do they tell us about today? So that's really where chapter 2 is going in its investigation. So as we go through chapter 2, the first article is by Ted Genoway. It's called Here Be Monsters. It was written in the more immediate after effect of 9/11. Okay, the United States was struck famously. World Trade Centers came down. And all of a sudden, America felt very vulnerable. And we wanted, quite frankly, to set things right. We went to war. But the question became, who are these enemies? Right? And we started maybe seeing enemies all around us. Ted Genoway talks about this, right? This search for monsters to kind of lay the blame. And how sometimes innocent people or peoples can be caught in the crossfire. Daniel Cohen, writes about the birth of monsters, and he looks at some older monsters, many of whom are lost, or if they're still around, they don't have the kind of power that they used to. He talks a fair bit about the Griffin, right? A monster that, if it weren't for Harry Potter being in Gryffindor, we might have completely forgotten about. These monsters of the past had symbolic meaning. Right? The people who believed in them, the people who were afraid of them, did so for reasons. And when they were in awe of them, again, there were reasons that reflected their time and place. One of my favorite monsters that he talks about is the Roc, R-O-C, a gigantic bird, so huge it gathers up elephants to feed its children, its little baby rocs with elephants that give you a sense of the size of the Roc. The next piece in chapter 2 is a passage from Beowulf. Okay, now Beowulf is an old English poem. Nobody knows exactly how old it is. It could be from the 600s of the Common Era to about the year 1000 of the Common Era. So it's at least 1,000 years old. And Beowulf is kind of a classic hero story in the sense that you have a guy, Beowulf, of great, tremendous strength, who's a great warrior. He defeats monsters that threaten his people and the allies of his people. The passage in our text is taken from near the end. It is the third and final monster that he must fight. And Beowulf must fight a dragon. And this is the European dragon that we're perhaps most familiar with. The one that has gold stored away. Even though it has no use for money, it is nevertheless greedy. And a person, an enslaved man, run away from his slavery, comes upon the dragon's gold and steals one item. When the dragon wakes up, it knows right away he's been the victim of theft. And as dragons do, breathing fire, goes and starts attacking all the villages that Beowulf rules. And so Beowulf must go one last time. He's an old man now. I should mention that. Right? His earlier battles were when he was young. This is 50 years later, so maybe he's in his 70s. And he's got one more fight that he's got to win. That's Beowulf. Myths of the Waters by Edward T.C. Werner is a discussion of the stories of Chinese dragons. As I said a little earlier, a very different look at the dragon myth. These dragons are positive. They're connected with fertility, growth, renewal, life. They're not threatening in that sense. Nevertheless, there's still some interesting stories connected to the dragon that Werner tells in Myths of the Waters. The next piece is by a person named Basil Johnston. Now, despite the very British sound of that name, Basil is actually from one of the First Nations, indigenous to North America. And he writes about the Wendigo. Now, the Wendigo, which has multiple different spellings, by the way, which you'll see in the book. The Wendigo is a creature, a monster, which is, how should I put this? It's a very strange and scary monster. It is very tall and very thin and voraciously hungry. And it is going to eat people. Now, there's a certain moral quality. Tends to be that people he eats, the Wendigo eats, are selfish, greedy people. People who think of themselves before their family, before their tribe, before their community. And here's the interesting part. The more they eat, the more they grow. And therefore, ironically, get even hungrier. The Wendigo is never satisfied. It's never enough. And it's interesting to take that and look at it as a metaphor for many things in today's world. Corporations that, let's say, have that profit motive, and there's never enough profit. The more profit they get, the more they need. Maybe the more natural resources are affected, devastated in the process of feeding the profit. Right? So the Wendigo, an interesting monster, comes to us from the First Nations, and yet has a pretty strong resonance in our own 21st century. Cursed by a Bite is by a guy named Matt Kaplan. Cursed by a Bite it stands out in our textbook really because it is the one article that really is more scientific. Most of what we talk about is psychological, cultural, right? We're addressing issues metaphors, what the Wendigo means metaphorically, for example, as I just got done saying. But Kaplan wants to say, hey, guys, don't be so smart. Or that is to say, don't think you're so much smarter than other people. Because what he does is he analyzes, based on what people knew at the time, why beliefs in things like vampires, zombies, and werewolves actually made sense. Now, you can tell from the title, Cursed by a Bite, all three of those monsters kind of replicate by bites, right? They bite somebody, and that somebody becomes another zombie or the werewolf. Or depending on the control of this vampire, right? That's how they make another vampire. We all know that because we saw Twilight, right? And Kaplan talks about, given the science that they knew, that the people of the time knew in the past, it is not so wild or irresponsible for them to think what they did about things like vampires. And so he analyzes that in Cursed by a Bite, particularly focused on the vampire and the zombie. More modern day, Japanese urban legends from Slit-Mouthed Woman to Kisaragi Station by Kimi. An urban legend is a story that we tell, maybe around a campfire, babysitting, sleepover nights, something like that. There's a lot of different urban legends. Some of them are very scary. Right? And Kimi introduces a couple of Japanese tales, where they come from and why. And there's also an interesting, how should I put it, little extra to it. As these legends get passed around, and the internet and our modern communications have made this happen more easily than it used to, they adapt and change for their new culture, new country, new audience, if you will, right? The values may be slightly different where they go. Sterling, AI is the scariest beast ever created. Artificial intelligence. Oh my goodness. What is going to happen because of AI? There's a lot of debate. But AI as a monster is definitely something to consider. Not just simply because nobody in this class, of course, students may use ChatGPT to write their papers for them. But ultimately, AI may do all the thinking for us. And there comes a point where, almost like something from a movie, there's no real need for human beings anymore. AI will just run the world for AI's own benefit. So Sterling examines this business with AI. Where is it going? What is it going to do? Can we control this beast that we've created that we hardly even understand, even as we create it? So these are the articles in chapter 2. Again, the idea is, how do monsters reflect their times? You go back to ancient times, almost prehistoric times. You can talk about today, all points in between. Our monsters change. We get new monsters, we drop old monsters. Or sometimes monsters, like the vampire is a great example, they change. The vampire several hundred years ago is not at all like the vampires most of the time portrayed in the 21st century. And I'm not just talking because of Twilight. Bram Stoker's Dracula changed the world on vampires, right? And so we need to examine that, look at that, consider that, and say, okay, if this is so, what is it telling about us, about our time or times in the past?